The air in the pediatric intensive care unit was a thick, sterile cocktail of antiseptic, fear, and the faint, cloying sweetness of fading hope. It was a place where silence was the loudest sound, broken only by the rhythmic, metronomic sigh of ventilators and the anxious chirping of monitors that stood sentinel over small, fragile bodies. Each beep was a prayer, each stretch of quiet a potential curse. In the center of this technological vigil, in a glass-walled room that felt more like a specimen case than a child's sanctuary, lay Leo. He was 7 years old, but his body, frail and defeated, seemed to have aged a lifetime in a matter of weeks. A rare, aggressive vascular anomaly was systematically shutting him down, a cruel thief stealing the breath from his lungs and the light from his eyes. Outside the glass, a tableau of despair had formed. Leo's parents, hollowed-out shells of the people they had been a month ago, clung to each other, their faces a mask of tear-streaked exhaustion. Around them, a cluster of white coats, the hospital's finest surgeons and specialists, stood in a posture of shared defeat. Dr. Albright, the chief of pediatric surgery, a man whose hands were insured for millions and whose reputation was built on performing miracles, had just delivered the final, devastating verdict. His shoulders slumped, the starched confidence of his coat seeming to wilt. There was nothing more they could do. The conventional paths had all led to this dead end. Into this fragile, grief-stricken silence stepped a man who carried no medical instruments, only the crushing weight of institutional authority. Julian Croft, the hospital's general counsel and senior vice president of risk management, was a figure sculpted from polished granite and tailored wool. His suit was a dark, expensive armor against the messy, unpredictable realities of human suffering. His presence was not comforting. It was an intrusion, a cold front moving through the warm, humid air of sorrow. He surveyed the scene not with sympathy, but with the detached appraisal of an actuary calculating a loss. His gaze flickered from the weeping parents to the defeated doctors, his mind already drafting the necessary paperwork, insulating the hospital from the inevitable fallout. And then there was her. Standing slightly apart from the main group, almost melting into the pale green of the hallway wall, was Dr. Eris Thorne. If Julian Croft was a monument to authority, Eris was a study in anonymity. She appeared young, far too young to be in such a high-stakes environment. Her standard-issue blue scrubs were slightly rumpled, worn soft with countless hours of work. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, severe ponytail, and her face, devoid of makeup, was pale and unreadable. She had been observing the case for 2 days, a quiet shadow at the edge of every consultation, her eyes fixed on Leo's vitals with an intensity that was unnerving. Croft had noticed her, of course. He had dismissed her instantly. A resident, he'd thought, eager, out of her depth, collecting trauma for her future memoirs. She was just part of the scenery, another cog in the vast, complicated machine he was paid to protect. Dr. Albright finally turned from the parents, his face etched with a profound and personal failure. He addressed the assembled team, his voice heavy. "We've exhausted all options. The malformation is too entangled with the primary aortic root. Any attempt to resect it conventionally would be catastrophic." He did not need to elaborate. Everyone in the hallway understood the grim finality in his words. The room was thick with the suffocating blanket of resignation. Then, a voice, quiet but clear as a ringing bell, cut through the gloom. "I can save him." Every head turned. The words had come from Eris Thorne. She had pushed herself off the wall, her posture still unassuming, but her eyes were now locked on Dr. Albright, and they burned with a cold, focused fire that seemed utterly alien to her otherwise plain appearance. A ripple of disbelief passed through the doctors. The parents' heads snapped up, their faces a canvas of desperate, terrified hope. Julian Croft's expression soured, his lips tightening into a sneer. A resident, playing hero. He took a step forward, ready to quash this interruption before it could blossom into a liability. But Albright, A man, clinging to the last shred of a physician's oath, held up a hand, silencing him. He looked at Eris, his skepticism warring with a desperate need to believe. "What are you proposing, doctor?" Eris stepped forward, her movement economical and precise. She did not look at the monitors. She seemed to have their data imprinted on her mind. A subaortic transcaval resection with in situ vascular reconstruction. We can isolate the aorta, bypass it using a synthetic percutaneous shunt, and then collapse the affected vessel to excise the malformation from the interior wall. It removes the risk of a primary aortic breach. The silence that followed was of a different kind. It was no longer grief-stricken, but stunned. Albright's eyes widened. The other surgeons exchanged looks of bewilderment. What she described was not in any textbook. It sounded like science fiction, a theoretical procedure one might propose in a research paper, not in a hospital hallway with a child's life on the line. "That's theoretical," one of the surgeons stammered. "The risk of systemic collapse, the clotting, the sheer complexity—" "It is not theoretical," Eris stated simply. Her calmness was jarring. It was the calm of a person stating that the sky is blue. There was no ego in her voice, no hint of arrogance. It was a statement of fact. This was the moment Julian Croft chose to strike. He moved past Albright, placing himself directly in front of Eris, using his height and the sheer force of his presence to loom over her. His voice was a whip crack of condescending authority. "Absolutely not." Eris did not flinch. She simply met his gaze. "This hospital," Croft continued, his voice dripping with venom, "will not be a laboratory for your reckless experiments, doctor." He spat the title as if it were an insult. "You are, what, a third-year resident? You come in here spouting some fantasy procedure you read in a journal, and you have the audacity to offer false hope to these grieving parents." He gestured vaguely toward Leo's family, weaponizing their pain. The parents flinched, the fragile spark in their eyes extinguishing as quickly as it had appeared. The other doctors shuffled their feet, looking away, unwilling to meet Croft's glare or Eris's unnerving calm. "It is not an experiment," Eris repeated, her voice losing none of its quiet firmness. "And it is not false hope. It is a solution." Croft let out a short, barking laugh that was utterly devoid of humor. It was a sound of pure derision. "A solution? You, a child in scrubs, have a solution that the chief of pediatric surgery and his entire team missed? Do you have any idea how arrogant you sound?" His ego filled the space, a toxic gas that made it hard to breathe. He saw her quiet defiance not as confidence but as insubordination, a personal affront to his authority. "My proposal is based on experience, not arrogance," she replied, her tone level. "Experience?" Croft scoffed, his voice rising in volume. He was performing now, making an example of her for the entire staff. "Let's talk about experience. I'm going to need to see your file, your full credentials, every procedure you've ever performed, every class you've ever taken. I want to see this experience that makes you feel you can override the judgment of every senior physician in this building and, more importantly, the legal and ethical protocols of this institution." He turned to Dr. Albright. "She is not to go anywhere near that patient. Is that understood? Her privileges are under review, effective immediately. Escort her to the third-floor conference room. I will be down in a moment to take her formal statement." The public humiliation was complete. In front of her peers, in front of the desperate family, she had been branded a reckless, arrogant amateur. She was no longer a doctor, she was a problem to be managed. A liability. Dr. Albright, a good man trapped in a broken system, looked at Eris with a pained expression, a silent apology in his eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to a security guard who had been standing discreetly down the hall. Eris did not argue. She did not raise her voice or show a flicker of emotion. Her face remained a placid mask. She simply gave a single, slow nod. As the guard approached, she turned and walked toward the elevators, her back straight, her steps measured. She did not look back at the weeping parents or the man who was gleefully preparing to dismantle her career. She simply walked away, an island of impossible calm in a sea of turmoil. To Julian Croft, her silence was an admission of guilt, the retreat of a child who had been properly scolded. He smirked, a tight, self-satisfied expression. The situation was contained. The liability was neutralized. But one person in the hallway saw something else entirely. Nurse Evelyn Reed, a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan, had been restocking a supply cart nearby, a silent witness to the entire exchange. She was a woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes that had seen more than their share of unkindness. She had watched Eris for the past 2 days, intrigued by the young doctor's quiet intensity. And when Croft had unleashed his tirade, Evelyn had not seen a chastened resident. She had seen something she recognized from the dust-choked field hospitals of Kandahar. It was the stillness, the utter lack of reaction to the shouting, the threats, the public shaming. It wasn't fear or submission. It was a terrifying sort of focus, the profound calm of a person whose baseline for chaos was so far beyond a shouting lawyer that he didn't even register as a threat. She had seen that same stillness in the eyes of Delta operators and SEALs, men who could watch a world burn around them and still calmly assess the next move. Julian Croft thought he was staring down a doe-eyed resident. Evelyn Reed was certain he had just picked a fight with a wolf. And in that moment, she knew she had to do something. Croft, puffed up with his victory, addressed the defeated surgeons with a magnanimous air. "Now," he said, his tone shifting to one of a patient teacher, "let's focus on compassionate end-of-life care and ensuring the family is supported through this difficult process. Albright, my office, in an hour. We'll need to formalize the incident report." He turned, his expensive shoes squeaking on the polished linoleum, and strode toward the elevators, a conquering hero in his own mind. The moment he was gone, the tension in the hallway did not dissipate. It curdled. The surgeons dispersed, mumbling to each other, their faces a mixture of shame and frustration. They knew the lawyer was an arrogant fool, but he held the power. To defy him was to risk their own careers. Leo's parents had collapsed onto a bench, their sobs now quiet, hopeless whimpers. The brief, impossible flare of hope had been cruelly snatched away, leaving them in a darkness deeper than before. Evelyn Reed watched them for a moment, her heart aching. Then her resolve hardened. She abandoned her supply cart and walked briskly to the main nursing station. Her mind was racing. That stillness in Eris Thorne's eyes was not an accident. It was a product of training, of experience so profound it had reshaped her very soul. Croft had demanded to see her file. Evelyn decided to grant his wish. Logging into the hospital's HR database was a risk. Accessing personnel files outside of official channels was a fireable offense, and with a lawyer like Croft on the warpath, it could be far worse. But the image of Leo, small and helpless behind the glass, and the memory of Eris's impossible calm, pushed her forward. She typed in her credentials, her fingers flying across the keyboard. A moment later, she was in the system. She searched for Thorne Eris. The file that appeared was strange. It was mostly empty. Her medical degree from a top university was there, as were her residency placements, but they were just data points. The usual details, personal statements, letters of recommendation, lists of published papers, were all missing. In their place were large blocks of black digital redactions. And at the top of the file, a bright red banner flashed with a warning. Level 7, clearance required. For official eyes only, unauthorized access is a federal offense. Evelyn's blood ran cold. This was not a normal employee file. This was something else entirely. She scrolled down, her heart pounding against her ribs. Most of the employment history was redacted. 10 years of her life were simply a black box labeled Service, U.S. Government. But at the very bottom of the file, under the emergency contact section, was the anomaly that made her stop breathing. There was no husband, no parent, no sibling. There was just a single line of text. Emergency Protocol, Aegis Mandate. Beside it was a phone number. It was not a standard 10-digit number. It was a long string of digits, prefixed with a code she didn't recognize. It looked more like a satellite uplink code than a telephone number. Aegis Mandate. The words meant nothing to her, but they felt heavy, ancient. This was it. This was the key. Whatever Eris Thorne truly was, the answer lay at the other end of this number. She scribbled it down on a stray piece of paper, her hand shaking slightly. She logged out of the system, wiping her digital footprints as best she could. She looked at the number scrawled on the paper. Making this call was an act of faith, a leap into an unknown that could very well end her career and land her in serious legal trouble. But then she thought of the boy, and the choice became no choice at all. She folded the paper, tucked it into her pocket, and walked toward the stairwell, seeking a private, untraceable landline. Meanwhile, on the third floor, Eris sat in the sterile silence of Conference Room B. It was a soulless space, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that reflected the cold, fluorescent lights above. The air smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. The security guard stood outside the door, a visible symbol of her new status as a prisoner. She was not handcuffed, but she was contained. She was not thinking about Julian Croft. She was not thinking about her career, or the medical board, or the public humiliation. Men like Croft were background noise, insignificant variables in a much larger equation. They were temporary obstacles, predictable in their arrogance and easily navigated. Her mind was elsewhere, thousands of miles and a decade away, in a place that smelled not of carpet cleaner but of dust, iron-rich blood, and cordite. The memory rose unbidden, as vivid as the room around her. The tent was a maelstrom of controlled chaos, the air thick with the screams of the wounded and the urgent, shouted commands of medics. Outside, the rhythmic thump of mortar fire provided a grim percussion. She was 28 years old, but she was already a veteran of 100 such scenes. This was her operating theater, a canvas tent in the middle of a war zone, her tools laid out on a sterile cloth draped over an ammunition crate. On the makeshift table before her lay a young ranger, no older than 19. His body was a jigsaw puzzle of shrapnel and trauma. A pressure mine had detonated beneath him, and the blast had shredded the entire left side of his torso. The field medics had done their best, but he was bleeding out from a dozen places at once, his primary mesenteric artery severed in a place no one could reach. Her commanding officer, a seasoned surgeon named Colonel Davies, had taken one look and shaken his head. "He's gone, Thorne. Tag him and move on. We have 3 more incoming with a chance." She had looked at the boy on the table, at his pale, sweat-slicked face, and then at the monitor, where his blood pressure was plummeting toward 0. And she had felt not panic, not despair, but a cold, clarifying rage. This was not an acceptable outcome. She looked at Davies. "No, sir." Davies' eyes had widened. "Did you say no to me, Captain?" "I can save him," she had stated, her voice the exact same quiet, firm tone she had used in the hallway for Leo. "How?" Davies had demanded, his voice incredulous. "His aorta is compromised. You touch it, he exsanguinates on the table in 30 seconds. "I'm not going to touch it from the outside," she had replied, her mind already working, her hands reaching for instruments. "I'm going in through the vena cava. I'll create a temporary shunt, collapse the vessel, and repair the tear from the inside out." Davies had stared at her as if she had lost her mind. It was a procedure that had never been done. It was something she had theorized, sketched on napkins in the mess hall, a wild, improbable idea born from desperation and genius. To attempt it, here, now, under these conditions, it was madness. "That's insane," he'd breathed. "You'll kill him." "He's already dead, sir," she had countered, her eyes never leaving the boy's failing body. "This is his only chance." For a long moment, Davies had stood frozen, trapped between protocol and the desperate, impossible confidence radiating from the young captain in front of him. He looked at the boy, then back at her. He saw the same stillness Evelyn Reed would see a decade later. It was the look of someone who had already calculated every variable and accepted every risk. Finally, he had given a sharp, reluctant nod. "You have 5 minutes, then I'm pulling you off." She didn't need 5 minutes. Her hands had moved with a speed and precision that was not entirely human. They were a blur, dancing through the intricate, bloody landscape of the soldier's body. She had improvised a shunt from a salvaged catheter. She had used microsurgical tools designed for ophthalmology to suture the delicate inner wall of the artery. The tent, the mortars, her commanding officer, it all faded away. There was only her, the patient, and the problem, and she was the solution. 4 minutes and 18 seconds later, she had pulled her hands back. The bleeding had stopped. The boy's blood pressure miraculously began to climb. He was alive. Davies had stared, speechless at the monitor, then at her blood-soaked gloves. He hadn't praised her. He had simply looked at her with a kind of awe and terror, as if he had just witnessed a fundamental law of physics being broken. That was the first time she had performed the Thorn Protocol. It would not be the last. That young ranger had been the first of more than 100 soldiers, spies, and civilians. She would pull back from the brink of death in forgotten corners of the world, earning her a name spoken only in hushed, reverent tones in the highest echelons of the military. The Ghost. The surgeon who did the impossible. A sharp rap on the conference room door shattered the memory, pulling her back to the sterile, silent present. The door opened, and Julian Croft strode in, a folder in one hand and a smug, predatory grin on his face. "All right, Doctor," he began, dropping the folder onto the table with a loud slap. "Let's have a chat about your future. Or rather," he added, leaning forward on his knuckles, "the lack thereof." In a cramped janitor's closet on the 5th floor, Evelyn Reed held the receiver of an old, dusty telephone to her ear. The air smelled of bleach and old mops. She had found a disused analog line, the kind that couldn't be easily traced by the hospital's internal switchboard. She had taken a deep, steadying breath and dialed the long, strange number from the piece of paper. The line did not ring. There was a click, a burst of static, and then a synthesized, inhuman voice spoke a single word. "Authenticate." Evelyn froze. Authenticate what? How? She had no code, no password. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had come this far only to fail at the first step. In a moment of pure, desperate instinct, she spoke into the receiver, her voice trembling but clear. "Aegis Mandate. I'm calling about Colonel Eris Thorn." There was a half-second of silence. She thought the line had gone dead. Then another click, sharper this time. The static vanished, replaced by the crisp, clear sound of a secure connection being established. A new voice came on the line, calm, professional, and radiating an intensity that traveled through the wire. "This is Nightfall. Go ahead." Evelyn's throat was dry. "My name is Evelyn Reed. I'm a nurse at Mercy General Hospital. There's a situation here. Dr. Thorn, Colonel Thorn, is being detained. She's been blocked from performing a life-saving surgery on a child." She quickly, concisely explained the entire situation. Leo's condition, Eris's proposed procedure, Julian Croft's intervention, the threats to Eris's career. The voice on the other end, Nightfall, did not interrupt. He listened with an unnerving patience. When she finished, there was another brief pause. "Stay on the line," Nightfall said. The connection remained open, but she could hear the faint, muffled sounds of a door opening and a brief, urgent, one-sided conversation in the background. She heard phrases like active asset, civilian interference, and immediate extraction. The words sent a fresh wave of fear and adrenaline through her. She had not just called a superior officer, she had triggered something far more significant. A moment later, a new voice boomed through the receiver, a voice that seemed to vibrate with immense power and barely contained fury. It was deep, gravelly, and commanded absolute attention. "This is General Marcus Vance. Ma'am, state your name and location again." Evelyn's knuckles were white as she gripped the phone. A 4-star general. She had been expecting, at most, a JAG officer or concerned aide. She repeated her name, the hospital, her position. General Vance listened, his breathing a low, controlled rumble. "This lawyer," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What is his name?" "Croft, Julian Croft," Evelyn stammered. "And Colonel Thorne's location?" "The third-floor conference room. Room B." There was a final, chilling pause. Then the general spoke, and his words were not a promise but a statement of impending reality. They were the sound of a storm breaking, of an avalanche starting its descent. "We are en route. Do not engage with the lawyer. Do not speak to anyone about this call. Help is coming." The line went dead. Evelyn slowly lowered the receiver back into its cradle. The silence of the janitor's closet rushed back in, but it was different now. It was the silence of the air before a lightning strike. She had done it. She had called down the thunder. Now, all she could do was wait for it to land. Down in Conference Room B, Julian Croft was enjoying himself immensely. He circled the table like a shark, lecturing Eris on medical ethics, on hospital policy, on the legal ramifications of her stunt. He was building his case, laying the foundation for her professional execution. "You see, Doctor, what you fail to understand is that a hospital is not the Wild West," he pontificated, his hands gesturing grandly. "We have rules, protocols. They exist to protect patients from people exactly like you, arrogant, overconfident residents who think they know better than decades of established medical science. You put this hospital, its reputation, and its financial stability at enormous risk." Eris sat perfectly still, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She listened to his tirade with the mild, detached interest of a biologist observing an insect. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. Her silence seemed to inflame him further, driving him to new heights of condescension. "I've already drafted a preliminary report to the State Medical Board," he said, tapping the folder on the table. "By the time I'm done, you won't be able to get a job swabbing floors in a veterinary clinic. Your career, the one you've worked so hard for, is over. And all because you couldn't keep your hero complex in check." He smiled, a cruel, triumphant curl of his lips. Was it worth it? It was at that exact moment that the universe chose to answer his question. The double doors to the conference room did not open. They exploded inward, slamming against their stoppers with a sound like a synchronized thunderclap. The noise was so violent, so utterly unexpected, that Croft physically jumped, letting out a small, undignified yelp. The heavy mahogany doors shuddered on their hinges. Framed in the doorway stood a figure that seemed to have been carved from the very concept of authority. General Marcus Vance, all 6'4" of him, stood in his full, immaculate Class A dress uniform. The deep green of the jacket was a stark contrast to the bland beige of the hospital. On his shoulders, 4 silver stars glittered under the fluorescent lights. A constellation of medals and ribbons covered his chest, a vibrant, silent testimony to a lifetime of service and conflict. He was flanked by 2 other men, tall, grim-faced officers in the severe uniforms of the Judge Advocate General's Corps. Their presence was not a request for entry. It was an invasion. The air in the room instantly changed. It became thin, sharp, electric. The ambient hum of the building seemed to die away, sucked into the vacuum created by their arrival. Croft, who had built his entire identity on being the most powerful man in any room, was suddenly, shockingly, not. He stared, his mouth slightly agape, his face a comical mask of confusion and outrage. He straightened his tie, a pathetic, instinctual gesture to reclaim some semblance of his shattered authority. "Who, in God's name, are you?" he sputtered, his voice a reedy squeak. "This is a private meeting. You can't just barge in here. I am the general counsel of this hospital." General Vance's eyes, the color of storm clouds, swept the room. They passed over Julian Croft as if he were a coat rack, a piece of insignificant background scenery. His gaze found Eris, who had not moved, who had not even registered surprise. A flicker of something, relief, respect, grim acknowledgement, passed through the general's hard features. He took a step into the room, his polished black shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. Then another. His movements were slow, deliberate, each step a hammer blow against Croft's fragile sense of control. He walked the length of the long table, his eyes never leaving Eris. The two JAG officers followed, taking up positions flanking the doorway, their posture rigid, their faces impassive. They were human walls. Croft, desperate to reassert himself, took a step forward. "I demand to know who you are and what you're doing here. This is a secure facility." The general did not even turn his head. One of the JAG officers spoke, his voice flat and cold as a morgue slab. "Sir, I suggest you remain silent." It was not advice. It was an order. Vance stopped 3 feet from where Eris sat. He looked down at her, and for a moment, the iron mask of his authority softened into something that looked almost like paternal concern. Then, with a motion so crisp and precise it seemed to cut the air, he raised his right hand to his brow in a formal, perfect salute. The gesture hung in the stunned silence of the room, an act of deference so profound and so unexpected it seemed to warp reality. A 4-star general, a man who answered only to the Joint Chiefs and the President, was saluting a rumpled-looking resident in a bland conference room. "Colonel Thorne," General Vance said, his voice a low, powerful rumble that resonated in the very bones of the building. The sound of the title, Colonel, detonated in the room like a shaped charge. "You are required. The asset is critical." Julian Croft's face, which had been flushed with indignant rage, began a slow, horrifying transformation. The blood drained from it, leaving behind a pasty, sickly white. His jaw, which had been set in a belligerent line, went slack. The word "colonel" echoed in the silent space, dismantling his entire world, brick by arrogant brick. He stared at Eris, at her simple scrubs and pale face, and his brain struggled, and failed, to reconcile the image with the title. Eris returned the general's salute with a small, graceful nod of her head. "General," she acknowledged, her voice still quiet, but now imbued with the authority he had just bestowed upon her. "The situation is under control." "Negative, Colonel," Vance corrected, his voice hardening as he finally, slowly turned his head to fix his gaze on Julian Croft. The full, undivided attention of his contempt fell upon the lawyer like a physical weight. Croft visibly shrank, his shoulders hunching as if to ward off a blow. "The situation," the general continued, his eyes boring into Croft's, "was a catastrophic failure of civilian oversight, and it is now being rectified." He took a step toward the lawyer, who instinctively took a step back, stumbling slightly. "You are Julian Croft?" Vance asked, though it was clear he already knew the answer. Yes, I am," Croft stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Croft," Vance began, and now his voice was a tool of surgical destruction, precise and utterly devastating. "You have, in the last hour, committed several acts that are of grave interest to the United States government. You have publicly threatened, professionally obstructed, and illegally detained a commissioned officer of the United States Armed Forces, an officer operating under a federal directive known as the Aegis Mandate." He paused, letting the words sink in. Croft's eyes were wide with terror. He looked like a man who had just realized the gopher he'd been trying to exterminate from his lawn was, in fact, the vanguard of an armored division. "This officer," Vance continued, gesturing with his chin toward Eris, "is not a resident. This is Colonel Eris Thorne, call sign Ghost. She is the lead trauma surgeon and chief medical officer for Joint Task Force Nomad, a Tier 1 special operations unit whose existence you are not cleared to know about. Her experience, which you so publicly questioned, includes performing life-saving surgeries in active war zones, plague-infested hot zones, and clandestine black sites that would make this state-of-the-art hospital look like a child's playpen. He took another step closer, forcing Croft back again. The experimental procedure you so arrogantly dismissed is officially designated the Thorn Protocol. It was designed by her, perfected by her, and has been used by her to save the lives of over 170 high-value assets, including senators, foreign dignitaries, and soldiers whose sacrifices allow you to sleep safely at night in your comfortable bed. It is not experimental. It is legendary. The general pulled a folded piece of paper from his breast pocket and unfolded it. He began to read, his voice a damning monotone. For extraordinary heroism under fire, the Distinguished Service Cross. For medical innovation resulting in the preservation of critical intelligence assets, the Defense Superior Service Medal. For actions above and beyond the call of duty, the Legion of Merit with V for valor. He listed 3 more, each one more astonishing than the last, a litany of heroism that filled the room and crushed what was left of Julian Croft's soul. He folded the paper and tucked it away. That, Mr. Croft, is her résumé. You demanded to see her credentials. You now have them. Vance's final move was swift and brutal. He turned to the JAG officer on his right. Captain, place this man under provisional arrest for violation of U.S. Code Title 18, Section 111, interfering with a federal officer in the performance of her duties. Contact the hospital board and inform them that their accreditation and all federal funding are under immediate and indefinite review, pending a full investigation into their security and personnel protocols. The captain nodded crisply. Yes, General. He and his colleague stepped forward, their expressions grim. One of them produced a pair of handcuffs. The metallic click echoed in the silent room. Croft stared at the handcuffs, then at the general, then at Eris. His face had crumpled into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The foundation of his world had not just cracked, it had been pulverized into dust. He, Julian Croft, the master of this universe, was being arrested. By soldiers in his own hospital. He sank into his expensive chair, a broken puppet whose strings had been cut, as the JAG officers moved in to secure him. General Vance turned his back on the pathetic scene, dismissing the ruined lawyer from his reality. He faced Eris once more, his expression softening again. The OR is prepped and waiting, Colonel. The boy? Eris stood up, her movements smooth and unhurried. The rumpled scrubs seemed to transform, to take on the authority of a uniform. She was no longer a resident playing hero, she was a commander taking charge of a battlefield. He's fading, but he's held on. He's a fighter. Good, Vance said with a firm nod. Go save him. Without another word, Eris walked past him, her eyes already distant, her mind focused entirely on the task ahead. She did not spare a single glance for the weeping, broken man being led away in handcuffs. He was no longer relevant. He was just noise that had been silenced. As she walked through the doors, the hospital staff, who had gathered in the hallway drawn by the commotion, parted before her like the Red Sea. Their faces were a mixture of awe, terror, and profound shame. Nurse Evelyn Reed stood among them, her heart soaring. She had not called down the thunder. She had merely opened the door for the storm, and the storm's name was Colonel Eris Thorn. Eris caught her eye as she passed, and for a fraction of a second the cold focus in her gaze softened. She gave Evelyn a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was more than thanks. It was a shared acknowledgement, a recognition between two soldiers who understood duty. Dr. Albright, the chief of surgery, rushed to her side, his face pale. Doctor, Colonel, I'm so sorry. We What do you need?" Eris did not slow her pace as she headed for the surgical wing. "I need or 3, she said, her voice calm and commanding. "A full vascular team on standby, but they are not to touch the patient unless I order it. And I need your best anesthesiologist. The boy's system is fragile. There is no room for error." Her authority was now absolute, unquestioned. The man who had moments ago been the pinnacle of the hospital's surgical prowess was now taking orders from the woman he had allowed to be humiliated. He nodded meekly. "Of course, anything." The journey to the operating room was a silent procession. Word had spread through the hospital with the speed of a virus. The story, already morphing into legend, was whispered in hallways and at nursing stations. The quiet resident was a secret war hero. The arrogant lawyer had been arrested by a 4-star general. It was a tale so dramatic, so cinematic, it felt unreal. But the sight of Eris Thorne, her face a mask of serene focus, flanked by military officers as she strode toward the OR, made it terrifyingly real. Inside the surgical suite, the atmosphere was electric. The team that had been assembled was the hospital's elite, but they moved with a nervous, uncertain energy. They were experts in their own world, but they were about to become assistants to a master from another. Eris entered the scrub room, and the world of lawyers and generals fell away. This was her sanctuary. The ritual was always the same, a centering process that had grounded her in the blood-soaked tents of Syria and the pristine high-tech theaters of Germany. She scrubbed her hands and forearms with a methodical intensity, the harsh antiseptic soap and bristly brush a familiar comfort. As she held her hands up, letting the water run from her fingertips to her elbows, she closed her eyes for a moment. She pictured Leo. She pictured the tangled, deadly knot of vessels inside his small chest. And she pictured the clear, precise path she would take to unravel it. When she pushed through the doors into the operating room, she was no longer Eris Thorne. She was the ghost. The team fell silent. The anesthesiologist, a man with 30 years of experience, looked at her and simply said, "He is stable, Colonel. Ready for you." Eris nodded, her eyes already on the complex array of monitors displaying Leo's life in flickering numbers and lines. She approached the table. For a moment, she simply looked down at the small, sleeping boy, a fragile life entrusted to her hands. She placed a hand gently on his forehead, a brief, silent promise. Then she turned to the surgical nurse. Scalpel. What followed was not surgery. It was artistry. Her hands, which had appeared so ordinary, so unremarkable in the conference room, were now instruments of impossible grace and speed. They moved with a fluid, hypnotic economy, a blur of motion that was both breathtakingly fast and yet perfectly controlled. The other surgeons who had been instructed to stand by watched, their mouths agape. They were witnessing a level of skill they had not known was humanly possible. She performed the Thorne protocol with a practiced ease that belied its staggering complexity. She created the bypass, isolated the aorta, and worked within the delicate vascular structures with a touch as light as a whisper. At one point, an unexpected microhemorrhage occurred, a complication that would have sent any other team into a controlled panic. Eris did not even pause. Her left hand adjusted a clamp with microscopic precision, while her right sutured the tear with 3 impossibly tiny stitches, all in the space of a single heartbeat. The crisis was over before the monitors had even had time to register it. The hours melted away. The world outside the OR ceased to exist. There was only the quiet beep of the monitors, the soft hiss of the ventilator, and the sound of Eris's calm, occasional commands. Suture. Retractor. Suction. Finally, after nearly 6 hours of intense, microscopic work, she made the final stitch. She pulled her hands back. "The reconstruction is complete," she announced to the silent room. "Close the bypass." The team, jolted back into action, scrambled to follow her orders. The critical moment arrived. As the synthetic shunt was removed and Leo's own, newly repaired aorta was allowed to take the full load of his circulation, every person in the room held their breath. They watched the main monitor. The line representing his blood pressure, which had been artificially maintained for hours, wavered for a terrifying second. Then it held, and then it began to rise, strong and steady. A collective, silent sigh of relief filled the room. The anesthesiologist looked up from his gauges, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Vitals are perfect," he breathed. He's completely stable." Eris simply nodded, her work done. She stepped back from the table, allowing the surgical team to begin the long process of closing the incision. She stripped off her bloody gloves and mask and dropped them into a bin. She walked out of the operating room without a word, leaving behind a team of medical professionals who knew they had just witnessed a miracle. In the hallway, General Vance was waiting, along with Evelyn Reed. The general's hard face was etched with relief. "Status, Colonel?" "The procedure was successful," Eris reported, her voice tired but steady. "The prognosis is excellent. He'll make a full recovery." Evelyn Reed's eyes filled with tears, and she let out a small sob of pure, unadulterated joy. Eris looked at her, and this time a small, genuine smile touched her lips. She walked over to the older nurse. "You did good, Evelyn," she said softly. "You followed your instincts. That's what a good soldier does." Evelyn could only nod, too choked with emotion to speak. "My transport is waiting," General Vance said. "We need to debrief." Eris nodded. Her time here was over. She had come to this hospital as a quiet observer and would leave as a legend. Before she turned to go, she looked at Dr. Albright, who had just emerged from the OR, his face a mask of awe. "His post-operative care will be critical," Eris told him, her voice once again firm and authoritative. "The full protocol is on the chart I prepared. Do not deviate from it. Not by a single milligram, not by a single minute." "We won't, Colonel," Albright promised, his voice filled with a newfound, profound respect. "I guarantee it." Eris gave one last look toward Leo's room, where a new set of monitors were already showing the strong, steady rhythm of a saved life. Then she turned and walked away with the general, her small, unassuming figure flanked by military power, disappearing down the hallway as quietly as she had arrived. Months passed. The story of the ghost surgeon became a permanent part of the hospital's mythology, a cautionary tale whispered to new residents about the dangers of arrogance and the reality that heroes rarely look the part. The hospital, under intense federal scrutiny, underwent a radical transformation. Julian Croft's entire risk management department was dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up, with a new focus on patient advocacy rather than corporate liability. New protocols, directly inspired by Eris's methods and military-style crisis management, were implemented hospital-wide. Nurse Evelyn Reed, hailed as a hero in her own right, was promoted to a newly created position, Director of Nursing Education and Protocol Integrity. She was tasked with ensuring that the lessons of that day were never forgotten. Julian Croft's fall from grace was as swift as it was brutal. Disbarred for gross ethical violations and moral turpitude, he also faced federal charges. His high-powered legal friends abandoned him. He pleaded guilty to the obstruction charge to avoid a trial that would have publicly aired his monumental incompetence and arrogance. He lost his license, his fortune, his reputation, and his wife. His name became synonymous with the kind of hubris that invites divine retribution. Leo made a complete and miraculous recovery. The Thorn protocol had not just saved him, it had cured him. Within 3 months, he was back at home. A happy, boisterous 7-year-old with a long, faint scar on his chest, the only physical reminder of his brush with death. His parents established a charitable foundation in Dr. Thorn's name, funding research into rare pediatric diseases, a testament to the anonymous doctor who had given them back their world. And Eris Thorn, she was gone. She never collected her final paycheck from the hospital. Her file in the HR system was wiped completely, leaving not even a redacted trace. She had vanished back into the shadows from whence she came. To the staff of Mercy General, she remained a ghost, a legend, a moment in time when the impossible had become real. 1 year later, Julian Croft sat in a cramped, dimly lit office, the air thick with the smell of dust and cheap coffee. His tailored suits had been replaced by a frayed, off-the-rack shirt. His empire had shrunk to this: a paralegal job at a small ambulance-chasing law firm, reviewing accident reports for billable hours. He was a broken man, haunted by the memory of a 4-star general's salute and the quiet, unshakable confidence of the woman he had tried to destroy. A small television, perched on a filing cabinet in the corner, was tuned to a 24-hour news channel. The volume was low, just background noise. The lead story was about a catastrophic earthquake in a remote, mountainous region of South America. The reporter was standing amidst a scene of utter devastation, describing the heroic efforts of international aid workers. While official rescue teams are still struggling to reach the more isolated villages," the reporter said, her voice filled with emotion. "Miracles are happening, thanks to a small, unsanctioned volunteer medical team that arrived here just 12 hours after the quake. Led by a mysterious American doctor, the locals have started calling El Ángel, the Angel. They have set up a makeshift field hospital and have reportedly been saving lives that everyone else had given up for lost." Croft glanced up at the screen, his interest mildly piqued. The camera panned across the chaotic scene, showing a line of injured people waiting outside a large tent. For a fleeting second, the camera zoomed in on the entrance of the tent, where a surgeon dressed in dusty, blood-stained scrubs was giving instructions to a local volunteer. Croft froze. His coffee cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor, but he didn't notice. It was her. Her hair was matted with dust, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with sweat, but there was no mistaking her. It was Eris Thorne. Her face wore the exact same expression of serene, absolute focus he remembered from that day. She was in her element, an island of calm in a world of chaos, doing what she was born to do. He stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. In that moment, the full, crushing weight of his arrogance descended upon him. It wasn't just that he had tried to ruin the career of a war hero. It was that he had stood in the presence of someone truly great, someone who dedicated her entire existence to mending the world, and he had been so blinded by his own petty ego that he had seen nothing but a threat to his own small authority. He had not just made a mistake, he had committed a sin against the very idea of human decency. The camera cut away back to the reporter, but Croft continued to stare at the empty screen, at the ghost who was still out there, saving the world, one impossible life at a time. And for the first time in his life, Julian Croft felt not anger, not self-pity, but a profound and soul-cleansing shame. It was the beginning of a long, arduous path, not to redemption, but simply to understanding what it meant to be small in a world that contained such giants.